Imagine waking up to find your entire city wrapped in perfect, undisturbed snow, except for one single trail of prints that start from nowhere and lead straight toward your front door. You follow them with your eyes, expecting a prank, an animal, anything that makes sense. But the tracks climb walls without slipping, stretch into impossible lengths, and at one point vanish completely, only to reappear inches from your doorstep, pressed so deeply into the snow you can feel the weight of something enormous still lingering there. And the worst part? The very first print is soaked in warm blood, and it is not human. If you think you ready to hear what left those tracks, stay. You not going to forget this story. Night after the blizzard lay frozen over Devonshire as though all of London had briefly forgotten how to breathe. The snowfall, fresh and unbroken, stretched across the streets like a pale shroud drawn over the city's restless heart. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed cleansed of motion, of noise, of memory itself. Yet with the arrival of dawn came the unmistakable realization that something had moved across the sleeping town, something that treated the snow not as hindrance, but as canvas. The first rays of light revealed a sequence of impressions carved into the immaculate white surface. Deep, narrow marks shaped like sharp hooves, placed with a precision that defied the natural gait of any known creature. They climbed the steep brick walls without disturbing a single flake, strode confidently across the slanted tiles of rooftops, and continued over the river's fragile ice, without causing so much as a groan from beneath. Those who witnessed the scene insisted no beast of flesh could leave such prints. The distance between some of them suggested a stride far longer than that of any horse, yet others were spaced close together, as though the unknown visitor had paused to consider its next impossible ascent. The snow that encircled the very first track was stained with a dark brownish blood, still glistening faintly in the weak morning light. It had not yet stiffened into the brittle crust that the winter cold usually commanded. Instead, it clung to the frozen grains with the tacky sheen of something freshly spilt, something that had been warm only moments before. Word traveled through the narrow lanes with strange ease, slipping beneath doors and around corners like a quiet, unwelcome draft. By the time the church bells marked the arrival of early morning, servants whispered to employers, parents hushed children, and even the street vendors who prided themselves on indifference to fear found their voices lowering instinctively. No one dared say the name of what they believed to be responsible, yet every stolen glance toward the roofs spoke of the same whisper. Something unnatural had stepped where no living thing should tread. The constables who arrived to assess the scene felt an unease that no training could steady. Their boots crunched loudly in the hush, violating the delicate perfection that the intruder had glided across without sound. One officer knelt near the bloodied track, gloved hand hovering above the stain. The warmth that still radiated faintly from the darkened pool unsettled him more deeply than any chilling wind. He withdrew his hand before contact, as if sensing that to touch it would be to acknowledge some unbearable truth. Snow should not hold warmth at dawn in the depth of winter, just as no creature should move so lightly across the weight of stone and timber. Residents gathered at a cautious distance, each person desperate to see, yet terrified to glimpse too much. Their breaths formed pale clouds that drifted upward only to be swallowed by the lingering chill. Some wondered whether the marks were a warning, others feared they were a promise. But all understood, in a way that required no discussion, that whatever had walked through Devonshire during the night knew no boundaries of man, nature, or reason. The snow had preserved its passage with haunting clarity, and the city, awakening slowly beneath the faint winter sun, found itself forced to confront the presence of something that did not belong to its world, nor to any world shaped by ordinary laws. By midday, the unease that had first clung to the narrow streets had seeped into the very bricks of Devonshire, settling there with the weight of something ancient and wet. The cold did not merely nip at exposed skin, it seemed to breathe against it, exhaling a damp, rasping chill that carried no trace of wind. Houses that had weathered countless London winters appeared to shrink into themselves, their stone walls absorbing the tremor that pulsed faintly through the air. It was as though the city had developed a second heartbeat, irregular and low, echoing beneath the snow-burdened roofs. Windows were shuttered not out of a desire for warmth, but from a deeper instinct, the kind that tightens the spine before the mind can make sense of danger. Families barred their doors with furniture, pushing heavy chests against frames that had never before required extra protection. Curtains were drawn with trembling hands, though every person knew that fabric would do little to stop whatever could glide across vertical walls as easily as a man might walk a level street. Mothers kept children away from the panes, warning them not to linger where shadows might notice. Outside, a group of rangers, men accustomed to the forests and moors beyond the city, moved with an uncharacteristic hesitance. They traced the hoof-like impressions as they wound across courtyards, up the faces of buildings, and over the pitched shingles where any living creature should have slipped to its death. Measuring rods and twine were brought out, yet each attempt to capture the stride of the unknown intruder resulted only in frustration. The distances were wrong. A series of prints would stretch impossibly far, as though left by something capable of crossing a street in a single bound, only for the next cluster to shrink to steps so small they could have been made by a toddler learning to walk. The rangers exchanged glances, not speaking aloud the thought that flickered across each face. A beast of flesh cannot change its proportions at will. Yet the tracks mocked that certainty with every variation. When one man pressed his palm into the snow beside a particularly deep print, he recoiled instantly. The snow was crushed so densely it felt more like cooled stone than frozen water, compacted with a force no natural limb could exert. Around other prints, the ground seemed subtly buckled, as if some immense weight had paused there. Yet the stride that followed suggested something impossibly swift and light. Meanwhile, the townspeople did their best to interpret the scene without truly understanding it. Some claimed the tracks traveled in patterns reminiscent of hunting paths, though no one could agree on what prey such a creature might seek within the city's stone confines. Others insisted that the prints revealed hesitation, as though the intruder had been searching for something specific, avoiding certain streets while doubling back across others. A few swore they heard faint thuds during the night, soft, unhurried, spaced too far apart to belong to any horse. But such stories were quickly silenced by anxious neighbors unwilling to let imagination worsen reality. By early afternoon, the constables who had joined the investigation began marking the paths with stakes, but the effort proved futile. Snow shifted, new flakes settled, and in places the tracks appeared to subtly alter while no one was looking. One officer stepped back from a line he had just marked and blinked in disbelief. The print at his feet seemed slightly different from moments before, the edges sharper, the depth marginally greater. He rubbed his eyes, blaming fatigue or cold, yet the discomfort in his stomach only deepened. Even the animals sensed what the humans struggled to comprehend. Dogs, usually boisterous in winter, cowered in corners and refused to follow their masters outdoors. Horses balked in their stalls, stamping nervously though no icy drafts touched them. Birds that typically clustered along the rooftops were nowhere to be seen. Not a single crow or sparrow dotted the skyline. The absence of their silhouettes made the city feel hollow, as though something had emptied the higher places of all living things. By late afternoon, the silence had grown heavier. It clung to the eaves and chimneys, settled between the cobblestones, and pressed itself into the spaces beneath doorframes. People no longer spoke in ordinary tones. Voices dropped to whispers instinctively, as though the air itself might betray them if disturbed. Every gaze, no matter how brief, drifted toward the rooftops or the angles where walls met, searching for the return of that impossible pattern. Yet the tracks remained still, embedded in the snow with the solemnity of a message whose meaning no one dared to decipher. And beneath the tightly packed drifts, beneath the layers that had been crushed by an unseen weight, there lingered a faint but chilling impression, not merely of a creature passing through, but of one that had paused, observed, and left of its own choosing, as if examining the city the way a hand might test the surface of a locked door. By the evening of the second day, the prints that had carved such defiant lines across Devonshire began to vanish with a subtlety far more unnerving than their arrival. Where once the tracks marched boldly over rooftops and walls, Entire segments of the strange path now ended abruptly, as though the creature had stepped into the air and simply chosen not to return. Snow lay smooth again in places where the deepest impressions had been, unbroken and pale, leaving behind no sign except a lingering heaviness in the atmosphere and a faint odor drifting along the narrow streets. It smelled of damp earth recently overturned and the metallic sharpness of iron, a scent that had no reason to cling to winter air unless something freshly alive, or freshly opened, had passed through. Those who braved the cold to examine the final intact marks felt an unexpected heat rising through the soles of their boots. It was not the timid warmth of thawing ice, but something faintly exhaled, as if the snow itself pulsed with the slow breath of a creature slumbering just beneath its crust. Some crouched close enough to brush gloved fingers against the surface, only to recoil at the sensation of softness where there should have been frozen rigidity. The whiteness seemed to give way with the slightest pressure, bulging almost imperceptibly, as though a pliant membrane stretched beneath it rather than compacted flakes. A few observers, their nerves frayed by 2 days of strain, stepped back abruptly, certain that the ground had shifted beneath them with a tremor too delicate to be a trick of the senses. Rumors grew rapidly, carried from door to door with the trembling eagerness of people desperate for structure and fear. Some whispered that the prince had never belonged to a creature at all, but to some spectral force that could alter the snow as easily as a painter alters his canvas. Others claimed the ground itself had briefly awakened, the city stirred by an ancient presence that had no shape except the impression it left behind. The more pragmatic citizens tried to reassure their neighbors that melt, frost, and drifting snow could all explain the disappearance, but every rational word felt thin, stretched across a truth too broad to conceal. Despite these shaky reassurances, the atmosphere in Devonshire tightened, pressing down upon its streets with a weight that seemed to thicken with each passing hour. Children were kept hidden indoors, their questions hushed, their curiosity redirected with forced calm that fooled no one. Men who usually laughed at superstition found themselves stopping mid-step to glance behind them, listening to the soft crunch of their boots with suspicion, half expecting a second set of footsteps to fall into rhythm with their own. The city wore its dread plainly, as though the stones themselves had accepted a new and unwelcome rhythm, a slow pulse beating beneath the frozen surface. As night closed in, some residents reported a faint vibration underfoot, subtle enough that only those standing still could detect it. It reminded them of the tremor of a distant carriage passing over cobblestones, except no carriage wheels echoed in the streets, no horses snorted in the stables, and no wind disturbed the heavy air. The sensation came and went like a breath held too long, returning just as one began to hope it had passed. Whether it was a trick of fear or a genuine echo of movement far below the snow, none could say with certainty. Yet those who felt it spoke of a growing conviction that something large lay dormant, waiting with a patience that did not belong to any living creature known to the city. Hope arrived in the form of desperate rationalization. Many clung to the possibility that the track's disappearance meant the creature, whatever it was, had departed, leaving Devonshire behind in search of some new terrain. Still, this hope carried a brittle edge, burdened by the knowledge that nothing about the visitor had followed natural patterns. If the prince had been made by something not bound to ordinary laws, then its departure, like its arrival, was unpredictable. The silence that followed the fading tracks felt less like relief and more like a held breath, suspended and awaiting its inevitable release. With the last light of dusk sinking behind the rooftops, the vanished prince left the city in a limbo between dread and denial. The snow glimmered with deceptive purity, hiding beneath its calm surface the memory of marks that had defied reason and violated the comfort of familiar geography. Every person who ventured outside that evening found themselves walking gently, cautiously, as if fearing they might disturb something vast lying beneath, something that could rise without warning, not with the suddenness of an attack, but with the slow, deliberate inevitability of a truth that refuses to remain buried. On the third morning, while the dim light of dawn still clung reluctantly to the rooftops, the city guard stumbled upon a sight that seemed to hollow out the very center of the square. A horse's harness lay abandoned in the snow, its leather straps twisted and frayed as though wrenched apart by invisible hands. No hoofprints led away from it. No signs of struggle marked the surrounding ground. Only an icy patch hovered faintly above the surface, a pale mist rising from it, as if the cold itself had been disturbed. The empty harness looked less like something dropped and more like something abruptly relieved of its burden, its animal erased without sound, struggle, or trace. A short distance away, the snow had collapsed into a shape that defied immediate comprehension. It was neither a footprint nor a crater, but an unsettling mixture of both, an impression that appeared to push outward rather than down, as though something had attempted to force its way up from beneath the earth and failed to fully breach the surface. The form suggested a torso with limbs sprawled at unnatural angles belonging neither to the anatomy of a beast nor the symmetry of a human body. Edges bent sharply where joints should not exist. The entire silhouette seemed to twitch with the memory of motion, even though it remained still and hollow. Guards approached with the hesitant reverence one might reserve for a grave that does not reliably contain what lies within. Each man sensed instinctively that proximity alone was a risk, yet curiosity tugged them forward with the cold persistence of a winter tide. The snow surrounding the strange shape bore marks unlike any the city had witnessed in the preceding days. It was not stamped down or melted. Instead, it had been cleanly removed in precise lines, as though carefully lifted away rather than crushed by weight. The exposed ground beneath showed a thin layer of frost arranged in a curving pattern, one that did not match the silhouette above it, but instead radiated outward, almost like a ripple frozen mid-expansion. One guard knelt close enough to peer into the shallow depression. A faint shimmer clung to the inner edges, a thin film of something neither liquid nor solid, catching the weak sunlight with an undulating gleam. When he extended a gloved hand, a surge of instinct forced him to stop inches short. Though no heat rose from the impression, the air above it felt subtly warped, as if the space itself had been stretched and had not yet fully returned to its original shape. He withdrew, shaken by a sense that something had attempted to emerge from beneath the square, something vast enough to distort the world around it in the effort. By mid-morning word of the discovery had made its way through Devonshire, and small gatherings formed along the edges of the square. People kept a respectful distance, their breaths forming pale clouds that drifted toward the center before dropping abruptly, as if discouraged by an unseen barrier. The empty harness and the contorted impression began to feel like a tableau arranged for the living, a reminder that the unseen visitor left more than prints across rooftops. It left absences, silent, decisive, and final. Speculation bloomed with a nervous fervor. Some believed the creature had taken the horsehole, lifting it bodily into the air, though no one could explain how it might have done so without leaving any mark. Others insisted the horse had been dragged below the snow, though the ground remained undisturbed except for the uncanny silhouette. A few muttered about creatures that could peel back the layers of the world the way a surgeon peels back skin, slipping between spaces without breaking the surfaces they crossed. Those words were met with sharp glances and swift shushing, for such thoughts felt too close to truth. Even the most skeptical townspeople could not ignore the atmosphere that hung over the square. A thick stillness settled over the scene, muffling the usual sounds of morning commerce. The clatter of carts, the murmur of tradesmen, even the distant church bell all seemed to dampen as they approached the square, as though the air absorbed sound with deliberate intent. The city had grown accustomed to fear in the previous days, but this silence belonged to something deeper and more deliberate than ordinary dread. As the light rose fully, a thin veil of frost began to form over the empty harness, trailing delicately toward the warped depression as though drawn to it. Snowflakes that drifted too close altered their descent, spiraling unnaturally before touching the ground. Some citizens retreated indoors, unwilling to watch the square behave like a living organism adjusting to a wound. The guards eventually roped off the area, but the measure felt meaningless. Nothing about the scene suggested that distance offered protection, nor that observation made one safer than ignorance. The square remained a cold tableau of disappearance, a reminder that whatever had walked through Devonshire was not bound by the constraints that governed the city's ordinary fears. It left traces not just on surfaces but within them, as if testing the limits of a world too fragile to hold its presence. By nightfall, a new wave of snowfall descended upon London, a fierce, swirling mass that swept through Devonshire as though the sky itself had grown frantic. The storm carried a strange intensity, as if the wind were attempting to speak for those who had already fallen silent, its howling threading through the streets with an urgency that the living could neither interpret nor bear. Snow draped itself over rooftops and alleys in rapid, suffocating layers, erasing familiar contours and replacing them with shifting dunes of pale, restless powder. Yet even in the storm's chaotic fury, one path remained unervingly distinct, a solitary line of fresh tracks that cut cleanly through the city's edge and stretched toward the desolate outskirts where the marshlands began. The prints, at first glance, resembled the same sharp, hoof-like impressions that had terrorized the city for days. They marched steadily away from Devonshire, as if the unseen visitor were abandoning the city with deliberate purpose. But those who dared to follow the trail, hunching against the punishing wind, soon realized the tracks grew stranger the farther they strayed from the safety of stone and lantern light. At the boundary where cobblestone yielded to open landscape, the impressions split unnaturally in two, each pair diverging like forked limbs searching separate directions. A few paces more, and the prints fractured again, multiplying into a trio of intertwined shapes that hinted at limbs growing or retracting at the creature's whim. Snow lashed sideways, cloaking visibility in a dense, churning veil, but even through the storm the trail remained disturbingly clear. The prints stretched gradually in length until each impression spanned nearly the height of an adult, creating strides that would have required a leap beyond human capability. The distance between them grew so vast that those following were forced to pause, squinting into the storm to locate the next faint depression lurking beneath fresh drifts. The ground trembled faintly beneath certain stretches, as if the creature had pressed its full weight into the earth in moments of exertion or hesitation. Then, with equal abruptness, the tracks would resume a pattern of light, airy touches, as though it skimmed across the surface with impossible grace. As the pursuers reached the first stretches of marshland, the pattern shifted yet again. The prints abruptly ceased, vanishing mid-step as though cut away cleanly by an invisible hand. There were no drag marks, no scattering of disturbed snow, no evidence of a turn or stumble. The creature had simply risen, leaving the world beneath it untouched. In the space where the next print should have been, the snow remained pristine save for a single darkened streak carved across its surface. It was neither a footprint nor a scrape. Instead, it resembled the mark left by something immense gliding effortlessly above the ground, its presence brushing so lightly against the snow that only a thin, soot-colored trail remained to betray its passing. The line was disconcertingly straight, extending forward in silent defiance of the storm. Snowflakes avoided it, drifting aside as though repelled by some residual force. The darkness of the mark held a faint sheen, reflecting the sporadic flicker of lanterns carried by the braver souls who had followed the trail this far. Some swore the streak pulsed faintly beneath the falling snow, expanding and contracting as if echoing the breathing of an unseen body suspended just beyond sight. No one dared to cross it. The marshland stretched outward, a bleak expanse where the ground beneath the snow concealed pools of stagnant water and patches of treacherous ice. The wind shrieked across the empty plain, its voice rising higher as it swept toward the dark line, only to falter at its edges as though encountering a silent command. The storm was at its most violent here, yet the streak remained untouched, immune to the whims of nature. Many turned back, overwhelmed by the creeping certainty that the creature had not fled but transitioned, leaving behind the limitations of earthbound movement. Others convinced themselves it had departed into the air, crossing some unseen boundary between land and the vast emptiness beyond. Yet even those who favored rational explanation could not shake the feeling that the marshlands had become a threshold, a place where the familiar world thinned enough for something else to seep through. The dark streak persisted long after the storm began to settle, a quiet testament to an entity that could reshape not only snow and soil, but the very rules of movement. It lingered like a scar across the whitened field, marking the place where the trail no longer belonged to any creature that walked, but to something that had chosen to rise above the earth entirely, unbound by gravity, reason, or fear. When the storm finally broke, its frenzy collapsing into a sullen, exhausted hush, the marshlands revealed something far more unsettling than any of the twisted tracks that had come before. Snow lay quiet and dense across the stretches of frozen mire, but at the heart of the open expanse yawned a perfectly circular crater, as though a great weight had dropped from the heavens and vanished beneath the surface without leaving so much as a ripple. The hollow glowed faintly from within, a weak bluish radiance pulsing like the last breath of a dying ember. Its edges were unervingly smooth, untouched by claw, hoof, or tool, as if the earth itself had been instructed to part and had obeyed without resistance. Around the rim, the snow had not melted. Instead, it had transformed into something brittle and translucent, a delicate crust of glass-like shards that snapped under the slightest pressure. A warm exhalation was enough to fracture them, scattering their fragments in the wind like pieces of shattered frost. Those who approached close enough to peer into the cavity felt a cold that did not belong to winter, a chill that seemed to climb the spine rather than cling to the skin. The bottom was nowhere to be seen. The light that emanated from the depths illuminated nothing except the curve of the descending walls before it was swallowed by perfect, starless black. The disappearance was total. Not only the last of the strange footprints had been erased, but a portion of the hardened earth had vanished with them. It looked as though something immense had burrowed downward, not with claws or force, but through some other means entirely, slipping silently into the ground while carrying its own shadow into the depths. Whispers spread quickly among those who gathered at the crater's edge. Some claimed the depression pulsed faintly, rising and falling like the throat of a slumbering beast. Others insisted they heard a hum just below hearing, a vibration that lingered in the teeth long after they stepped away. Yet even fear must bow to exhaustion. After days of panic, sleepless nights, and warnings carried by the tolling of bells, the city allowed itself a tentative breath of relief. The hollow, mysterious as it was, felt like an ending. Whatever had carved the path of frozen dread through Devonshire seemed to have retreated into the earth itself, abandoning its hold upon the living world. By dusk, the crater had become the subject of murmured prayers and uneasy laughter, a bizarre landmark to be avoided but no longer feared with the same paralyzing immediacy. The townspeople convinced themselves that the nightmare had simply passed on, leaving behind a wound that would slowly freeze over and be forgotten. But dawn had different intentions. The first light of morning revealed a thin veil of new snowfall across the city, a fresh, unsullied layer laid down with the quiet precision of a craftsman smoothing a sheet over a sleeper. The storm had exhausted itself many hours earlier, yet here was snow as if sculpted in the night, gleaming with an undisturbed purity that felt almost ceremonial. Chimneys had not yet begun to smoke, and the streets were empty, but a peculiar stillness clung to every corner, a hush that seemed less like the calm of early morning and more like the pause before a verdict. It was on the main street, the heart of Devonshire's daily bustle, that the discovery stopped every thought of relief cold. Across the immaculate blanket of snow stretched a single line of prints, sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. They were the same impossible tracks that had haunted the city for days, the same shape that no man, beast, or known design could claim. But this time the path did not trail away toward the countryside or circle the outskirts in mocking loops. It came from nowhere and went directly into the city. The first imprint began at the edge of the street without any preceding disturbance, as if the creature had stepped into existence upon the snow itself. From there the chain marched steadily inward, each mark placed with unwavering confidence. The stride was neither rushed nor hesitant. Instead, it possessed the dreadful calm of something that no longer needed to search. The tracks cut down the center of the street like a declaration, their direction clear, aimed straight toward the heart of Devonshire. By the time the townspeople gathered, the sun had only just begun to rise, its pale light spilling across the rooftops and catching on the frozen edges of the prints. The glow made them seem deeper, as though the snow beneath each step had been pressed by a weight far greater than before. A tremor passed through the crowd as realization settled with an icy grip. Whatever had vanished into the earth the previous day had not fled. It had only learned the way back.